February 6, 1944, 3 hours before dawn, a place called Sinswaya in the Arakan hills of western Burma. Brigadier Geoffrey Evans is standing in the dark beside a bamboo thicket listening. Around him, spread across a clearing roughly 1,200 yards long and 800 yards wide, are several thousand men. Most of them are not infantrymen. They are clerks, signallers, cooks, mule handlers, ordnance technicians, the soft administrative tale of an entire Indian division, crammed into a supply dump nestled between low jungles-covered hills that was never designed to be defended against anything more threatening than a stray patrol. The division's commanding general, Major General Frank Messervy, fought his way to this clearing through the darkness after Japanese soldiers overran his headquarters a few hours earlier. He arrived with a pistol, a torn shirt, and not much else. He had torn the rank insignia from his uniform to avoid being identified if captured. One account records that he led a small party out with a grenade in his hand. The Japanese are now behind them, in front of them, and on both flanks. The road south is cut. The road north is cut. The supply track through the Ngakyadok Pass, which the troops have nicknamed the Okidok Pass because nobody can manage the Burmese pronunciation, is in enemy hands. Colonel Tanahashi's 112th Regiment has marched clean through the division's rear area and is tightening a ring around the clearing. By every lesson the British Army has learned in Burma over the previous 2 years, what should happen next is not a matter of debate. It is a certainty. These men should retreat. They should abandon their supplies, destroy what they carry, and fight their way cannot back through the jungle toward the coast. That is what British and Indian troops have done every single time the Japanese have surrounded them since January of 1942. Every time, without exception. The pattern has never once been broken. Evans does not order a retreat. Instead, he does something that no British officer in Burma has done before at this scale. He orders the perimeter held. He tells the cooks to pick up rifles. He tells the clerks to dig slit trenches. He positions 20-odd artillery pieces around the clearing so they can fire outward in every direction, and tells the gunners to depress their barrels and prepare to shoot at point-blank range if they have to. 2 squadrons of Lee Grant tanks from the 25th Dragoons, the only armoured vehicles in the entire Arakan front, are placed at the most threatened points around the perimeter. Evans issues a single instruction that will become the most important tactical order given in the Burma theatre that year. Hold this position. Stay where you are. Keep the Japanese out. What happens over the next 18 days inside this clearing will shatter a tactical assumption that has governed the entire war in Southeast Asia. It will reverse a pattern of defeat stretching back more than 2 years and covering more than 1,000 miles. It will prove that a surrounded force supplied from the air can destroy the army that surrounds it, and it will set in motion a chain of events that will lead, 5 months later, to the single worst land defeat Japan will suffer in the entire Second World War. But none of that is visible yet in the darkness at Sinswaya. What is visible is this: a brigadier standing in a supply dump surrounded on all sides, choosing not to run, and a Japanese regiment closing in around him, utterly certain that what has always worked is about to work again. They were certain because they had reason to be. To understand why that confidence was so absolute, and why its collapse was so catastrophic, we need to go back, not to 1944, not even to 1943. We need to go back to January of 1942, to the fall of Rangoon, and the beginning of the longest retreat in British military history. Because what Geoffrey Evans did that night was not an act of spontaneous courage. It was the deliberate reversal of a doctrine of failure that had been designed by one man, tested under fire, and built on the ruins of a catastrophe that had humiliated the British Army from one end of Burma to the other. When Japan invaded Burma in January of 1942, the British garrison was weak, poorly trained, and psychologically unprepared for what hit it. The troops stationed in Burma were not frontline formations. Many were recently raised Indian battalions with inadequate equipment and minimal jungle experience. They had been trained for a European-style war, a war of roads, railways, supply depots, and clear front lines. They moved in lorries and expected their flanks to be protected by the terrain itself. The jungle, the dense green wall pressing in on every track and road, had been classified by British military doctrine as impenetrable. It was a barrier. You fought on the roads and in the valleys, and the jungle protected your flanks the same way a castle wall protects a courtyard. You did not go into it, and you did not expect the enemy to come out of it. The Japanese did not think this way. Their infantry had spent years fighting in China. Their soldiers were hardened, lightly equipped, and trained to carry everything they needed on their backs. They ate rice, supplemented with dried fish and pickled vegetables, rations that weighed a fraction of what a British soldier's food supply weighed. And they treated the jungle not as a barrier but as a covered highway. Where British officers saw impenetrable undergrowth, Japanese commanders saw concealed avenues of approach. Where the British expected an attack to come straight down a road, the Japanese sent a battalion through 20 miles of supposedly impassable forest and planted a roadblock behind the British position. The method was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Pin the British position from the front with a holding force, just enough men to keep the defenders looking forward. Meanwhile, send a flanking column through the jungle to cut the road behind them. Once the roadblock was in place, the British unit was cut off from resupply. It could not be fed. It could not be reinforced. It could not evacuate its wounded. And because no one had trained these men to fight when surrounded, because the entire British military doctrine in Burma assumed that being cut off from your supply line meant the battle was lost, the response was always the same: retreat, abandon the position, destroy the supplies you could not carry. Fight your way out through the jungle and fall back to the next defensive line, where the Japanese would move through the jungle again, cut the road again, and the whole sequence would repeat. The retreat from Rangoon to India covered more than 1,000 miles of mountain tracks, river crossings, and jungle paths. It lasted from March to May of 1942. Burma Corps lost most of its tanks, most of its motor transport, and around 13,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. Columns of exhausted soldiers trudged through the Chin Hills and up the Kabul Valley, which they called the Valley of Death, because of the malaria that killed men who had survived every Japanese bullet. Refugees, mainly Indian civilians fleeing the Japanese advance, died in their thousands along the same tracks. The survivors staggered across the Indian border gaunt, hollow-eyed, sick with malaria and dysentery, and carrying a defeat so complete that its psychological weight would take 2 years to lift. The Japanese did not pursue them into India. They did not need to. The monsoon broke and sealed the border with walls of rain and mud, and the British were in no condition to come back. One episode from the retreat captured the full scale of the disaster. At the Sitang Bridge in February 1942, the only crossing over the wide Sitang River, 2 brigades of the 17th Indian Division were still on the wrong side when the Japanese attacked at dawn. The bridge was blown to prevent its capture, stranding thousands of troops on the east bank. Men tried to swim across. Many drowned in the fast current, dragged down by their equipment. Others were shot in the water. The division lost most of its heavy weapons, all its transport, and thousands of men. It was the kind of catastrophe that stays in an army's memory for decades. The troops who made it across did so as individuals, not as fighting units, wading ashore on the far bank with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the rifles they had held above the water. The fall of Rangoon in March completed the humiliation. The capital and only major port fell to the Japanese after a series of confused engagements in which British and Indian units were repeatedly outflanked by an enemy they could not pin down. With Rangoon gone, there was no way to reinforce or resupply Burma by sea. Everything had to come over land from India, through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, or not come at all. The retreat north began in earnest, and it did not stop until the remnants of Burma Corps had crossed the Indian border nearly 3 months later. The first attempt to go back only made things worse. In late 1942, the British launched an offensive into the Arakan, the coastal strip of western Burma, aimed at recapturing the port of Akyab and its airfield. It was a frontal, road-bound advance against prepared Japanese positions, conducted in almost exactly the way that had failed during the retreat. When the Japanese counter-attacked in early 1943, they did exactly what they had always done. They sent columns through the hills the British had dismissed as impassable, cut the roads behind the advancing formations, and the British fell apart again. The first Arakan offensive failed completely at a cost of roughly 5,000 casualties, and achieved nothing except a further collapse in morale. The same mistakes had been made again. Troops tied to roads. Flanks assumed to be protected by jungle that was not in fact impenetrable. No plan, no doctrine, and no training for what to do when the Japanese appeared behind you. Lieutenant General William Slim, writing about this period, noted that in the Arakan the same mistakes had been made again and again until the troops lost heart. He was not being rhetorical. The problem was institutional. The British and Indian Army in the East had not merely been defeated, it had been defeated in the same way so many times that the defeat had become a reflex. Japanese troops appearing behind you meant the battle was lost. Being cut off meant retreat. The jungle was the enemy's country. These were not rational tactical assessments any longer. They were conditioned responses, buried so deep in the collective psychology of the army that simply issuing a new order was not going to change them. This was the army that William Slim inherited when he took command of the 14th Army. And Slim understood, with the clarity that only the best commanders possess, that the problem he faced was not primarily tactical or logistical. It was spiritual. His army did not need a new plan. It needed a new belief about itself. Slim was not a glamorous commander. He was not a cavalryman or an aristocrat or a product of the Guards regiments that dominated the social hierarchy of the British Army. He had been commissioned through the Birmingham University Officers Training Corps at the outbreak of the First World War, wounded at Gallipoli, and again in Mesopotamia where he won the Military Cross, and had spent most of his career in the Indian Army, which the British military establishment regarded as a second-tier posting for officers who lacked the connections or the money for a fashionable regiment. He was stocky, broad-faced, and plain-spoken. He had a jutting jaw and a broad nose, and one of the officers who served under him wrote that on his jaw was carved the resolution of an army. He did not look like a great captain of war. None of this mattered. What mattered was that Slim was, by the near-unanimous judgment of every historian who has studied the Burma campaign, the finest British general of the Second World War. Many historians rank him among the greatest British commanders since the Duke of Wellington. Slim rebuilt his army on three foundations, and he was explicit about their order. The first was spiritual, the second was intellectual, the third was material. Spiritual first, he wrote, because only spiritual foundations can stand real strain. By spiritual he did not mean religious faith, though many of his soldiers had that. He meant that the men needed to believe their cause was just, believe that their commanders would not throw their lives away on futile operations, and above all believe that they could win. He travelled constantly, visiting battalion after battalion, standing on the bonnet of a jeep and talking to the troops in language they understood, not the clipped abstractions of a staff officer, but plain, direct speech that acknowledged what they had been through and told them what was going to change. He told them plainly that the Japanese soldier was not a superman, that the Japanese was tough, yes, brave, certainly, skilled in the jungle without question, but that he could be beaten by men who were trained properly, led properly, and given the right tools to fight with. The intellectual foundation was a complete rethinking of how to fight in Burma. Slim studied the Japanese method with the cold precision of an engineer examining a machine. He stripped it down to its core mechanism. The Japanese won by encirclement. They moved through the jungle to get behind you. They cut your supply line, and then they waited for you to panic and retreat, at which point they captured your supplies, fed themselves on your rations, armed themselves with your ammunition, and pushed forward to do it again. Every victory the Japanese had won in Burma ran on that exact sequence, which meant that if you broke the sequence at any single point, the entire method collapsed. Slim identified the weakness that nobody before him had seen clearly enough to exploit. When the Japanese sent a flanking force through the jungle to cut your road, that flanking force was also cut off. It carried only what its soldiers could haul on their backs: a few days of rice, ammunition for a few engagements, no heavy weapons beyond mortars and light mountain guns, no resupply chain, no trucks, no depot behind it. The Japanese encirclement tactic depended entirely, completely on a single assumption. It assumed that the British would run, because if the British ran, the Japanese captured their supply dumps, and the captured supplies kept the whole offensive going. The Japanese war machine in Burma ran on British rations. Take that away and the picture reversed entirely. If the British refused to retreat, the Japanese flanking force was not the hunter. It was a body of light infantry stranded in the jungle with no food, no supply line, and no way to get either. It was the starving man who had walked into a trap of his own making. The tactical solution was conceptually simple, but required an act of enormous psychological courage to implement. When the Japanese cut your road, you did not retreat. You stayed. You formed a defensive perimeter, what Slim called a box, and you held it. You dug in, You positioned your guns and you fought off the attacks, and you waited. Because while you were waiting, transport aircraft would fly over your position and drop supplies by parachute, food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, mortar bombs, everything you needed to keep fighting falling from the sky on silk canopies, while the Japanese troops surrounding you slowly and inexorably starved. The air supply concept was not entirely new. The Americans and Chinese had been flying supplies over the Himalayas, the route they called the Hump, since 1942. The RAF had supported the Chindits by airdrop, but nobody had yet attempted to sustain an entire division in a fixed defensive position under continuous attack supplied entirely from the air for weeks on end. The logistics were formidable. A division consumed roughly 150 tons of supplies per day. That meant dozens of transport sorties every 24 hours, each aircraft flying over jungle and hills, often in poor visibility, often in range of Japanese ground fire, dropping loads that had to land inside a perimeter measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. If the aircraft could not fly because of weather or enemy action, the box would starve. If the Japanese gained control of the airspace over the drop zone, the resupply would be shot to pieces in the air. Everything depended on two things: fighter superiority over the drop zone, and the courage of the transport crews who flew their Dakotas low and slow over the fighting, throttles pulled back, cargo doors open, pushing bundles out into space while small arms fire cracked past the fuselage beneath them. Slim issued a directive to his corps commanders that contained the single most important sentence of the entire Burma campaign. He told them to instruct their troops to regard not themselves, but the Japanese, as surrounded. Think about what that sentence does to the mind of a soldier crouching in a trench. It does not change the tactical situation. The roads are still cut. The enemy is still on 3 sides or 4, but it completely reverses who is in danger. The surrounded force, fed from the air, has food and bullets. The surrounding force, cut off from its own supply line by the very jungle it used as a highway to get there, has neither. Time, which in every previous engagement in Burma had been the Japanese weapon, is now the British weapon. Every day the box holds is a day the Japanese grow weaker. Before Slim could test this doctrine in a major battle, he needed proof that British troops could survive deep in the jungle, supplied entirely from the air. That proof came from an unlikely and controversial source. In February 1943, a force of about 3,000 men under a deeply unconventional officer named Ord Wingate marched across the Chindwin River into Japanese-held Burma on a long-range penetration operation codenamed Longcloth. They were called the Chindits, after the Chinthi, the mythical guardian lions that stood at the entrance to Burmese temples. The operation was costly. Nearly a third of the force became casualties. The material damage they inflicted, some railway bridges, some supply lines, was limited and quickly repaired. Slim himself judged it a costly schooling. But the Chindits proved something that mattered more than any bridge they demolished or any railway track they cut. They proved that British and Indian soldiers could live, march, and fight deep inside the Burmese jungle, supplied entirely by airdrops for weeks at a time. They had gone in, operated behind enemy lines, and come out again. The psychological effect across the 14th Army was enormous. If the Chindits could survive behind Japanese lines for months, then a division sitting in a fortified box with tanks and artillery could certainly survive being surrounded for a few weeks until a relief column broke through. There was a second consequence that nobody anticipated. The Chindit expedition crossed mountain terrain that Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the Japanese commander responsible for the Burma-India frontier, had previously claimed was impassable for a large military force. Mutaguchi watched the Chindits march through his rear area and drew exactly the wrong conclusion. If the British could cross those mountains into Burma, he reasoned, then the Japanese could cross them in the other direction into India. The Chindits, by proving the jungle was passable, helped convince Mutaguchi to attempt the invasion that would consume and destroy his army. Slim also rebuilt his forces through relentless, focused training. Units were rotated through jungle warfare schools where they practiced patrolling at night, ambush techniques, stream crossing under fire, and close-quarter combat in dense vegetation. He arranged deliberately lopsided engagements, sending a full battalion with air support against a Japanese platoon, or a brigade reinforced with tanks against a single company position, so that his troops would experience victory in the jungle and begin to associate the green world around them with confidence rather than dread. A visiting staff officer watching one of these lopsided actions asked whether it was not using a steam hammer to crack a walnut. Slim's reply was characteristic. "If you happen to have a steam hammer," he said, "and you do not mind if there is nothing left of the walnut, it is not a bad way to crack it." The point was not the tactical result. The point was the effect on the men swinging the hammer. Every small victory chipped away at the myth that the Japanese were invincible in the jungle. Slim also worked on the practical details that affected morale as much as any speech. He improved the mail service so that letters from home arrived regularly rather than in random batches months late. He ensured that leave rosters were honoured, that hot food reached forward positions when it could, and that medical treatment, especially for malaria, was given priority. These were not grand strategic decisions. They were the mundane fundamentals that an army lives on, and Slim understood that an army that feels neglected fights like one. The troops of the 14th Army had taken to calling themselves the Forgotten Army. They were fighting in a theatre that received fewer resources than North Africa, fewer headlines than Italy, and less public attention than the planned invasion of France. Replacements were slow to arrive. Equipment was often second-hand, sent out after it had been used in other theatres and judged surplus. The climate was brutal, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the hot season, before the monsoon turned everything to mud. Malaria was so prevalent that at one point the number of men evacuated sick exceeded the number of battle casualties by a factor of more than 10 to 1. Slim attacked the malaria problem with the same methodical ferocity he applied to everything else, enforcing mepecrine discipline across the entire army until the infection rate dropped dramatically. The message was clear. This general cared about whether his soldiers lived or died, not as a matter of sentiment, but as a matter of operational effectiveness. An army that trusts its general fights differently from one that does not. By the beginning of 1944, Slim had an army that was retrained, re-equipped, and starting to believe in itself. He had a doctrine that turned the Japanese encirclement method inside out. He had air transport capability, squadrons of C-47 Dakota transports that could keep a surrounded force alive for as long as necessary. What he needed now was a battle to prove it all worked. The Japanese, with their own plans and their own fatal assumptions, were about to provide one. In early February 1944, the Japanese launched Operation Hago in the Arakan. It was designed as a diversionary attack. The real offensive, the invasion of India through Imphal and Kohima, was coming in March. Hago was meant to pull British reserves south into the Arakan so they would be unavailable when the main blow fell on the central front. The plan was for the Japanese 55th Division to encircle and destroy the 7th Indian Division within 10 days. The method was identical to every previous Japanese operation in Burma. Infiltrate through the jungle at night, cut the roads, seize the British supply dumps, wait for the inevitable British retreat. On the night of February 3rd, Colonel Tanahashi's 112th Regiment, the main striking force of the operation, crossed the Kalapanzin River and moved north into the rear of the 7th Indian Division. They moved fast and they moved quietly. Within 2 days they had passed through the British positions, taken the village of Tang Bazar, and turned south to strike the division's administrative area. Before dawn on February 6th, Japanese soldiers stormed into the 7th Division's headquarters. General Mesavy and his staff were caught completely off guard. In the confusion and darkness, Mesavy stripped off his rank badges, gathered a handful of men, and fought his way out. He spent hours moving through the jungle before reaching the admin box at Sinzwaya. This was the critical moment, the hinge on which the entire war in Burma would turn. In every previous engagement, the overrunning of a division's headquarters and the cutting of all its supply roads would have triggered an immediate general retreat. The pattern was 2 years old and had never been broken. Not once. But this time, the orders from 15th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Philip Christensen, were different. The forward divisions were to stay where they were. They were to dig in and hold their positions. They were not under any circumstances to withdraw. Brigadier Evans was ordered to reach the admin box, take command of the defence and hold the perimeter against all attacks. When Mesavy arrived, he left the immediate defence of the box to Evans and resumed direction of the wider divisional battle from inside the perimeter. The Lee Grant tanks deserve particular mention. The M3 Lee was an American design that had been obsolete in the European and North African theatres for more than a year by the time it fought in the Arakan. Its tall silhouette and sponson-mounted 75mm gun made it a poor match for the latest German tanks. But in Burma it was devastating. The Japanese had virtually no anti-tank weapons capable of penetrating its armour at normal combat ranges. A Lee Grant could drive to within 50 yards of a Japanese bunker, depress its gun, and blast the position to pieces while rifle and machine gun fire rattled harmlessly off its steel sides. The 25th Dragoons, a cavalry regiment that had traded horses for tanks, became the armoured backbone of the admin box defence, and their Lee Grants were the single most feared weapon on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers who charged the perimeter with bayonets and grenades ran straight into 30 tons of steel and high explosive. What Evans had to defend with was, on paper, completely inadequate for the task. The fighting troops consisted of 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, West Yorkshire Regiment, 2 squadrons of Lee Grant tanks from the 25th Dragoons, heavy vehicles that were never designed for jungle warfare but whose armour and 75mm guns would prove devastatingly effective at close range. About 20 artillery pieces from 6 batteries positioned to fire in all directions. Some elements of the 4/8 Gurkha Rifles who fought their way in later, and then several thousand men who had never expected to fire a weapon in combat. The administrative and logistical troops of the entire division, armed with rifles and Sten guns taken from wherever they could be found. Evans organised this mixed force into a defensive perimeter around Ammunition Hill, positioned the tanks at the most vulnerable points, told the gunners to prepare for direct fire at ranges measured in yards rather than miles, and waited for the Japanese to come. On the night of February 7th, something happened that transformed the battle and hardened the resolve of every man in the box. Japanese soldiers from Tanahashi's regiment infiltrated the perimeter and overran the main dressing station, the field hospital where the division's wounded were being treated. What followed was a methodical atrocity. The Japanese forced the doctors to hand over drugs and medical supplies. Then they killed the wounded where they lay, men on stretchers, men too badly hurt to stand. They lined up the captured medical officers and orderlies and executed them at close range. Around 35 medical staff and patients were murdered. Soldiers in nearby trenches could hear what was happening in the darkness, the shouts, the shots, but were under strict orders to hold their positions until first light. When a counterattack by the West Yorkshires, supported by the Lee Grant tanks, retook the dressing station area, they found the bodies. Only a handful of men had survived. The massacre did not have the effect the Japanese may have intended. It did not break the defenders or terrify them into seeking terms. It did the opposite. After the dressing station killings, every account of the battle records the same transformation. Uncertainty vanished. The question of whether to hold or retreat stopped being a question. The Japanese had made retreat and surrender synonymous with death. The men in the admin box now understood, in a way that no training exercise or morale lecture could have taught them, that there was no safety in running. The only option was to fight and to win. And then the sky opened. From February 11th, RAF and United States Army Air Force's transport aircraft, mostly C-47 Dakotas, began flying over the admin box in a steady stream and dropping supplies by parachute. Over the course of the battle, they flew 714 sorties and delivered 2,300 tons of food, ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Colour-coded parachutes drifted down onto the clearing, each shade marking a different type of cargo, so the men on the ground could sort ammunition from rations from medical supplies without opening every bundle under fire. Once Spitfire fighters established air superiority over the drop zone and drove off the Japanese aircraft that tried to interfere, the supply line was as secure as a road and far harder to cut. The defenders were eating full rations, firing fresh ammunition, and treating their wounded with proper medicine, while the Japanese soldiers surrounding them, who had marched in carrying only enough rice for a few days because the entire operational plan assumed they would capture the British supply dumps within the first week, began to starve. This was the inversion, the precise mechanical reversal that Slim had designed and predicted. The besiegers were now the besieged. The Japanese had thrown a ring around the admin box, but they were the ones trapped inside a closing fist. They could not feed themselves. They could not resupply their ammunition. They had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping the Lee Grants. And the men they had surrounded, the cooks and clerks and signallers they had expected to scatter at the first bayonet charge, were not scattering. They were fighting with increasing ferocity, backed by tanks that moved through the jungle like steel elephants, crushing bunkers and firing into Japanese positions at ranges so close that tank commanders could see the faces of the men they were killing. The Japanese attacked the perimeter night after night for nearly 3 weeks. They broke through in several places. Each time they were thrown back by counterattacks spearheaded by the Lee Grant tanks. A feature called Ammunition Hill changed hands multiple times in fighting that was often hand-to-hand, with bayonets and grenades at distances of a few feet. The artillery fired over open sights, directly into charging infantry, the gunners cranking their barrels down until they were nearly level. The fighting was savage and relentless, and the defenders held. Meanwhile, Tanahashi's regiment was being destroyed. His original strength of roughly 2,150 men was ground down over 18 days to approximately 400. By late February, Tanahashi refused further orders to attack, judging further assaults to be pointless, and began withdrawing his shattered regiment without authorization from his superiors. On February 16th, relief columns from the 5th Indian Division began pushing through the Ngakyadauk Pass from the west. By February 22nd, the pass was clear. The siege ended around February 23rd. Roughly 5,000 Japanese dead were counted in the hills and jungle around the admin box. The actual losses were certainly higher because the Japanese carried away some of their wounded and abandoned others to die in the undergrowth where they could not be counted. Allied casualties were also significant, but the result was unambiguous. For the first time in the entire Burma campaign, the British and Indian Army had been surrounded by the Japanese, had refused to retreat, had been supplied entirely by air, and had destroyed the force that surrounded them. The encirclement tactic, the weapon that had conquered all of Burma and driven the British 1,000 miles back to India, had been turned into a death trap for the army that used it. Slim called the Arakan battle one of the historic successes of British arms. He wrote that its effect on the entire 14th Army was immense. For 2 years the Japanese had held the psychological initiative in Burma. After the admin box, they never held it again. The soldiers of the 14th Army had watched a garrison of clerks and cooks and mule handlers stand their ground, call in the Dakotas, and grind a Japanese regiment into the dirt. If they could do it, anyone could. The Japanese High Command did not absorb this lesson. Perhaps they could not. General Mutaguchi, who had been planning the invasion of India for months and who possessed an ambition that exceeded his judgment by a considerable margin, watched his Arakan diversion fail and pressed ahead with his main offensive regardless. Operation U-Go, the offensive aimed at the British positions at Imphal and Kohima in northeast India, launched across the Chindwin River in March 1944. It was the largest Japanese land operation of the entire war in Southeast Asia. 3 full divisions, roughly 85,000 men, along with elements of the Indian National Army, crossed the river and advanced through the mountains toward the Indian frontier. Mutaguchi's ambition extended far beyond a defensive spoiling attack or a local territorial gain. He dreamed of reaching the Brahmaputra Valley and pushing on to Delhi itself, believing that a Japanese army on Indian soil would trigger a general nationalist uprising against the British and cause the entire colonial structure to collapse. It was a vision of grand strategic transformation, achieved by a single bold stroke, the kind of thinking that produces either masterpieces or catastrophes, and almost nothing in between. The plan rested on a logistical assumption so reckless that Mutaguchi's own divisional commanders openly questioned it to his face. The army would carry roughly 3 weeks of supplies. After that, the troops would feed themselves by capturing British supply dumps, which Mutaguchi assumed would fall quickly. For the march across the mountains, he proposed what he called Genghis Khan rations, herds of cattle and water buffalo that would be driven across the Chindwin alongside the troops and slaughtered for meat as needed. His divisional generals were appalled. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, commanding the 31st Division, told his staff officers before they crossed the Chindwin that starvation was the likely outcome. Lieutenant General Yanagida of the 33rd Division was equally pessimistic. Mutaguchi overruled them all. The offensive went ahead. Slim saw the Japanese offensive coming and made a decision that demonstrated the kind of calculated nerve that separates competent generals from transformative ones. He did not try to hold the Chindwin River crossings. He did not fight forward in the jungle where Japanese infiltration tactics were at their most effective. Instead, he chose to fight on the Imphal plain, the broad, open ground around the city of Imphal in Manipur, where his tanks and artillery could operate effectively, where his fighter aircraft could support ground troops, and where his forces could be supplied by air from bases in Assam. He was, in effect, applying the admin box lesson at the scale of an entire army. Let the Japanese come. Let them cross the mountains. Let them reach the extreme end of their supply line, and then let them break themselves against defended positions they could not capture, in terrain where British armour could manoeuvre while their own soldiers starved. The Japanese moved faster than Slim expected. By late March they had cut the road between Imphal and Kohima, isolating the 4th Corps on the Imphal plain. But Slim had already proved at the admin box that isolation from the road network was no longer a death sentence. It was an invitation. When Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, secured 20 American C-46 transport aircraft from the supply route over the Himalayas to augment the existing fleet, the airlift swung into action at a scale that dwarfed the admin box operation. The entire 5th Indian Division, battle-hardened from its victory in the Arakan, was lifted by air from the coastal front to the central front at Imphal. Each brigade move required 260 Dakota sorties. The 7th Indian Division followed by the same method. Entire combat formations were being moved hundreds of miles by air in the middle of a battle, landing on airstrips surrounded by enemy forces and going straight into action. Before the main battle at Kohima began, a smaller action played a role that was out of all proportion to the forces involved. The 50th Indian Parachute Brigade, under Brigadier Hope Thompson, was stationed at the village of Sangshak, directly in the path of the Japanese 31st Division advancing toward Kohima. The paratroopers were not deployed to jump. They fought as infantry, dug in on a hilltop with limited water and ammunition against elements of 2 Japanese divisions. For 6 days, from March 20th to March 26th, they held. The fighting was ferocious. Japanese attacks came at night, wave after wave, and the paratroopers threw them back with grenades and bayonets. The brigade lost 652 men, but it inflicted over 400 casualties on the Japanese 58th Regiment, and, crucially, delayed the advance on Kohima by approximately 1 week. That week gave the British time to reinforce the Kohima garrison, thin as that reinforcement was. Even more important, documents taken from the body of a dead Japanese officer at Sangshak revealed the entire operational plan of the 31st Division. Instead of the single regiment the British had expected, a complete division of 15,000 men was heading for Kohima. Slim now knew what was coming. While the main battle developed at Imphal, the most desperate fight of the entire campaign was unfolding 70 miles to the north at Kohima. Sato's 31st Division, approximately 15,000 strong, descended on the small hill station that straddled the only road connecting Imphal to the railway junction at Dimapur. If Kohima fell and Dimapur was captured, the Imphal garrison would be cut off not merely from road supply, but from the railhead that sustained the entire front. Everything, every bullet, every tin of bully beef, every pint of fuel came through Dimapur. The garrison at Kohima was tiny. Colonel Hugh Richards, a former Chindit officer who knew what it meant to fight surrounded and undersupplied, commanded roughly 2,500 men. About 1,000 of them were non-combatants, convalescents, and administrative staff who happened to be at the hill station when the Japanese arrived. The fighting corps of the defence was the 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, supported by elements of the Assam Regiment, a locally raised force that fought with extraordinary determination on its home ground, and the Nepalese Share Regiment. They were holding a ridge. 15,000 Japanese soldiers were coming to take it from them. The siege of Kohima compressed into a few hundred yards of hillside some of the most intense small unit fighting of the entire Second World War. The Japanese pushed the defenders back ridge by ridge, position by position, until the garrison held only the area around a feature called Garrison Hill. At the tightest point, the entire British perimeter had contracted to an area roughly 350 yards across. The most famous position in the battle, and one of the most famous in the entire war, was the District Commissioner's bungalow and its tennis court. The British held one end of the court, the Japanese held the other. The net posts were still standing, but the net was gone. The white lines were still chalked on the ground. Grenades were thrown back and forth across the width of the court. Men fought and died within meters of each other, separated by the distance of a baseline. Water was rationed to about 1 pint per man per day. The wounded lay in open slit trenches under Japanese mortar fire and sniper fire with no possibility of evacuation. The garrison held for a fortnight. Relief came when the British 2nd Division broke through the Japanese roadblock at a village called Zubza and fought their way up to the ridge around April 18th. The original garrison, exhausted and reduced, was relieved, but the battle for Kohima was far from over. It took until May 13th before the tennis court position and the district commissioner's bungalow were finally recaptured. Lee Grant tanks of the 149th Royal Armoured Corps drove up to the Japanese bunkers on the ridge and fired their 75mm guns directly into the firing slits at a range of 20 yards. It was that kind of battle. At Imphal itself, the 4th Corps under Lieutenant General Geoffrey Scoones fought a series of savage engagements around the perimeter of the plain that stretched across dozens of miles and lasted weeks. The Japanese 33rd Division attacked from the south, driving up the Tiddim Road toward Imphal. The 17th Indian Division, which had been fighting its way back from Tiddim, turned and held at Bishanpur in some of the bitterest fighting of the campaign. At Sheenham Saddle, a pass in the hills to the southeast, the 20th Indian Division fought a Japanese combined arms formation known as Yamamoto Force in an attritional battle among the cloud-covered peaks that dragged on for months, positions changing hands again and again in conditions reminiscent of the Western Front in the First World War. The Japanese never broke through. At Nungshigam Ridge, which overlooked the main airfield and whose capture by the Japanese in early April threatened to shut down the entire air supply operation, the 5th Indian Division mounted a counterattack on April 13th that became one of the most remarkable armoured actions of the war. Lee tanks of the 3rd Carabiniers, a cavalry regiment converted to armour, drove up slopes that the Japanese had considered far too steep for any tracked vehicle. The tanks clawed their way to the crest, slewing and grinding on the muddy hillside, and blasted the Japanese bunkers at point-blank range. The ridge was retaken, but the cost was severe. Every British officer in both the tank squadron and the attacking infantry battalion, the 1st 17th Dogras, was killed or wounded in the assault. The scale of the Japanese supply failure defied belief. Mutaguchi's 15th Army had crossed the Chindwin with roughly 20 days of food for an operation that would last nearly 4 months. The gap between what the plan assumed and what reality delivered was lethal. Japanese soldiers stripped bark from trees and boiled it into a thin broth. They ate snakes, lizards, and insects. They slaughtered and consumed their pack horses and mules, which removed their ability to move ammunition and heavy equipment forward. Medical supplies ran out within the first weeks. Malaria, which infected the majority of both armies in Burma, was treatable on the British side with mepicrine tablets supplied by air. On the Japanese side, there was nothing. A soldier who went down with malaria lay where he fell until he recovered or died, and in a starving body weakened by weeks of combat and exposure, recovery was the exception rather than the rule. By the 1st of May 1944, the Japanese offensive had stalled across the entire front. Their attacks on the Imphal perimeter had gained ground in places but had failed to take any of the key positions. At Kohima, the 31st Division was pinned, and now the trap that Slim had designed closed exactly as he had intended. The Japanese had been fighting for weeks. Their 3 weeks of supply had run out sometime in the late March. The cattle herds, Mutaguchi's Genghis Khan rations, had scattered into the jungle during air attacks or been consumed long before the animals could be properly butchered. The soldiers were eating grass, roots, and the leather straps of their equipment. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi were tearing through formations that had no medicine, no shelter, and no way to evacuate the sick or the dying. Men were perishing not from British bullets, but from starvation and disease, and the rate of attrition was accelerating with every day that passed. Sato, at Kohima, had predicted this exactly. By mid-May, his 31st Division was starving. A captured rice warehouse at Naga village that could have sustained his men for months had been located and destroyed by British bombing. Resupply convoys struggling across the Chindwin brought mostly artillery shells and anti-tank ammunition, the wrong supplies for an army that was dying of hunger, not a shortage of firepower. On May 25th, Sato sent a signal to Mutaguchi's headquarters stating bluntly that he would withdraw his division on June 1st unless supplied with food. Mutaguchi ordered him to hold his positions and threatened him with a court-martial. Sato's reply entered the annals of Japanese military history. He signalled back, Do what you please, I will bring you down with me. His final message to 15th Army headquarters contained a judgment on Mutaguchi's planning staff that was extraordinary in its contempt. The tactical ability of the 15th Army staff, Sato wrote, lies below that of cadets. On the last day of May, without authorization, he began withdrawing his shattered division from the Kohima Ridge. This act of open defiance, a Japanese divisional commander directly disobeying his army commander's orders and insulting his competence by official signal, was almost without precedent in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. It measured the completeness of the collapse. Sato was not a brilliant or imaginative general. Slim himself assessed him as the most unenterprising of all the Japanese commanders he faced. A man whose bullet head was filled with only one idea, to take Kohima and hold it. Hold. But Sato was honest enough to see what Mutaguchi refused to see. The operation had failed. Continuing to hold meant the extinction of his division for no purpose. He chose his men over his orders. Mutaguchi continued to demand attacks from his other divisions through June, but the orders had lost all connection to reality. Starving men cannot assault fortified positions held by well-fed troops supported by tanks and aircraft. On July 8, 1944, Mutaguchi finally acknowledged the collapse of Operation Yugo and issued orders for a general retreat across the Chindwin. The retreat that followed was not a military withdrawal, it was a death march. The Japanese called it the Road of Bones. Soldiers too weak to walk lay down beside the mountain tracks and died where they fell. Artillery pieces, vehicles, and heavy equipment were abandoned because the horses and mules were all dead, and no human being had the strength to move them. The monsoon arrived and turned the trails into rivers of brown mud. Men who slipped and fell could not get back to their feet. When the Allies retook the border town of Tamu at the end of July, they found 550 unburied Japanese corpses scattered through the streets and surrounding jungle. More than 100 wounded soldiers lay among them, slowly dying, abandoned without food or medical care. The numbers describe a catastrophe without parallel in Japanese military history. Total Japanese casualties for the Yugo operation reached approximately 55,000 to 60,000, of whom roughly 13,500 were confirmed killed. Many historians believe the true death toll was considerably higher, because during the retreat the Japanese lost the ability to count or recover their dead. The overwhelming majority of casualties were not from combat. They were from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. British and Indian forces at Imphal suffered approximately 12,500 casualties. At Kohima, the figure was about 4,000. Of the 85,000 men that Mutaguchi led across the Chindwin in March, less than a third made it back. Of those who did return, many were so broken by starvation and disease that they never fought again. Mutaguchi sacked all three of his divisional commanders during the operation. Yanagida went first, then Yamochi, who was already dying of disease. Sato was last. Then Mutaguchi himself was relieved of command on August 30th, 1944, and forced into retirement by December. Sato demanded a court-martial so that he could publicly expose Mutaguchi's criminal incompetence in open proceedings. The Imperial Japanese Army, unwilling to expose its internal disgrace to daylight, instead declared that Sato had suffered a mental breakdown and quietly retired him. The institutional machinery of the Japanese military, which had no mechanism for public accountability and no doctrine for admitting failure, chose to bury the truth. Slim, by contrast, was knighted by the Viceroy of India at Imphal in December 1944. His corps commanders, Scoons and Stopford, received the same honour. The 14th Army, which had endured 2 years of being called the Forgotten Army, because the campaigns in Europe consumed all the headlines and most of the resources, had just won what many historians consider the largest land battle in British history. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten wrote to his wife on June 22, 1944, that the battles represented the most important defeat the Japanese had ever suffered in their military career. The Japanese Foreign Office official Kasi Toshikazu, writing after the war, called the disaster at Imphal perhaps the worst of its kind, yet recorded in the annals of war. In Japan, the word Imphal entered the national vocabulary as a byword for catastrophic institutional failure, the kind of reckless top-down decision-making where subordinates see the disaster coming, superiors refuse to listen, and an entire organization marches over a cliff because nobody has the authority or the moral courage to say stop. The victory at Imphal and Kohima did not merely stop the Japanese, it broke them as a fighting force in Burma. Slim's 14th Army went on the offensive in the autumn of 1944, crossed the Irrawaddy River in one of the most brilliantly conceived deception operations of the war, and retook Rangoon in May 1945. The army that had been humiliated in 1942 reconquered the entire country in a campaign that military historians consistently rank among the finest of the Second World War, and every element of that subsequent victory, the confidence of the troops, the aggressiveness of the junior commanders, the willingness to be cut off and fight on without panic, traced directly back to the admin box and the Imphal plain. The soldiers of the 14th Army knew they could beat the Japanese in the jungle because they had already done it when the odds were at their worst. There is a cemetery at Kohima today. On the memorial stone is carved an epitaph composed by John Maxwell Edmonds, borrowed from the Spartan tradition at Thermopylae. It reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, 'For your tomorrow we gave our today.'" It is among the most famous war memorials in the world, and it stands not on a European battlefield that schoolchildren learn about, not on a beach in Normandy that tourists visit by the million, but on a jungle hillside in Nagaland that most people in Britain have never heard of, marking a battle that most history books in English barely mention, where an army that called itself Forgotten won the greatest land victory in its nation's history. Consider what had actually happened. The Japanese had used the same tactic that had conquered Burma in 1942, infiltrate through the jungle, encircle the enemy, cut his supply lines, wait for him to panic and withdraw. The tactic itself had not changed. The Japanese soldiers were every bit as brave and disciplined as they had been 2 years before. What had changed was the reaction. The British refused to cooperate with the Japanese plan. They stood their ground, they formed their boxes, they called in the aircraft, and they let the Japanese army strangle itself on a strategy that required its enemy's participation to function. In 2013, the National Army Museum in London held a public debate to determine Britain's greatest battle. Historian Dr. Robert Lyman argued the case for Imphal and Kohima. His competitors were formidable: Waterloo, the Battle of Britain, D-Day and the Normandy campaign, Agincourt. The audience listened to the arguments, weighed the evidence, and voted. Imphal and Kohima won. Britain's greatest battle, according to the museum's audience, was not fought on the fields of Belgium or the beaches of northern France. It was fought on a jungle ridge in northeast India and across a muddy plain in Burma by soldiers who had been defeated and humiliated and driven 1,000 miles in retreat, and who came back and annihilated the army that had beaten them. That is how the British turned being surrounded into a Japanese disaster. It did not happen because of superior technology. It did not happen because of overwhelming numerical advantage. It happened because one general looked at a tactic that had defeated his army every single time it had been employed and asked a question so simple that it was almost embarrassing. What happens if we just refuse to leave? The answer to that question destroyed an army, shattered a myth of invincibility, and altered the course of the war in Asia. And it all began with a brigadier standing in the dark in a supply dump in the Arakan hills, surrounded on every side, choosing not to run.